Good evening, everyone. On behalf of AGBU, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. The recent deliberate dawn of war by Azerbaijan on Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh has led to thousands of deaths and the mass displacement of Armenian people in the region. It has fueled the fire of a long-standing conflict, not only in Nagorno-Karabakh, but gave rise to political upheavals in Armenia itself. This lecture series brings together scholars and seasoned experts to encompass a variety of topics to frame the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict around its heavy and variegated burdens of the past, from the Ottoman and Soviet era to present-day geopolitical layers. The lecture series raises critical awareness on the implications of destruction of cultural monuments, as well as possibilities to pacify a region shaken by war and crisis for a long time. Earlier in 2020, the Lepsius Haus, which is a research center for genocide studies in Germany, and the Armenian General Benevolent Union in Lebanon signed a memorandum of understanding to promote joint collaboration and establish a mutually beneficial relationship built on cooperation. And this series is the first outcome of this partnership. And now I would like to welcome Dr. Roy Knoke, the Deputy Director of the Lepsius Haus, to deliver his opening remarks. Roy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irene. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Lepsius Haus Potsdam, I really look forward to this lecture series with the AGBU Lebanon, with which we started cooperating in 2015. Please allow me some words about the Lepsius Haus, located in Potsdam near Berlin, and you can see it here in the background. It is a foundation-based research center, and its mainly focus is on the history of the Armenian genocide and the humanitarian relief work for Armenians in the Ottoman Empire around the 1900s. We broach this topic in different formats like talks, workshops, and in this case, a lecture series, as well as academic conferences, amongst others, in close association with international partners like the AGBU or the University of Potsdam. And as Irene mentioned, this event is only the start of a series, and tonight with a historical focus. So you are all welcome to join the second event on September 17th, where we will discuss more political aspects of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And we will keep you, of course, updated for details. Without further ado, let me introduce the moderator for the evening. Melanie Tanielian is an associate professor in the history department at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and the director of the Center for Armenian Studies, which is also located in Ann Arbor. Her most important publication, The Charity of War, deals with how the Ottoman home front, inter alia in Beirut, grappled with total war and how it sought to mitigate starvation and sickness through relief activities during World War I. Currently, she's working on a new book, preliminary titled Transnational Lunacy, Madness, Society and Citizenship in World at War, 1914 to 1919. Thank you all for joining us, and Melanie, please, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome, everyone. It's so nice to be here this evening. And before we begin today's discussion, that is titled Embattled Dreamlands, a history of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I would like to thank, of course, the organizers of this wonderful webinar, Rolf Hosfeld and Roy Knoke from the Lepsius Haus, as well as Irene Azarian and Miral Hanamirian and Liana Melkonian from the AGBU in Beirut, Lebanon. I've spent many years and summers in Lebanon, and especially in Beirut, and it's a city that's very close to my heart. So the way we will proceed is that I will introduce our speakers for today, and who will then each talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will welcome, of course, your questions. And you can submit your questions into the chat function at any time during the webinar, and we will try to answer as many as we can. I want to remind you that this is really an event that is focusing on the history of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Of course, the mobilization of memory within historical, or the mobilization of history within the memory of the former conflict. As Roy just mentioned, for a more contemporary and policy and geopolitical driven event, we'll ask you to dial in September. So I would like to just go ahead, and then I'll disappear from the screen, introducing my colleague and friend Ronald G, who, as you probably all well know, is a force in the field of the history of Armenian studies, as well as, of course, Soviet history. Ron is the William Sewell Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan currently, and is also an Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History from the University of Chicago. He was my predecessor, and he was the first holder of the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of Michigan, and where he also founded and directed the Armenian Studies program for many years. He's the author of many, many books, countless articles, and among them, I'll just list a few, are the Baku Commune. I think that was his first book in the 1970s, Class and Nationality in the Russian Revolution, The Making of the Georgian Nation, Looking Towards Ararat, Armenia in Modern History, The Revenge of the Past, Nationalism, Revolution, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, The Soviet Experiment, They Can Live in the Desert but Nowhere Else, A History of the Armenian Genocide, The Red Flag Unfurled, History, Historians, and the Russian Revolution. And in 2020, he published 2 books, Red Flag, Wounded, Stalinism and the Fate of the Soviet Experiment, and his most recent book that took a while to write and will take you a while to read as well, was a book that, of course, was long in the making, titled Stalin, Passage to Revolution, which came out with Princeton University in 2020. He's currently working on a book on the recent upsurge of exclusivist nationalisms and authoritarian populism, preliminarily titled Forging the Nation, The Making and Faking of Nationalism. Our second speaker today is Dr. David Leupold, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the research at the Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin, Germany. And he's part of a research unit that thinks about representations of the past as a mobilizing force. So he is, of course, going to talk around this theme of mobilizing the past. Before David joined the Leibniz-Zentrum, he was with us in Michigan from 2018 to 2019. He was the Manoogian postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Armenian Studies. And he holds a doctoral degree from the Humboldt University to Berlin with a dissertation that investigated contested landscapes of memory in Eastern Anatolia. His first monograph came out last year, Embattled Dreamlands, The Politics of Contesting Armenian, Kurdish, and Turkish Memory. And it is based on the research that he did for his PhD thesis. Recently, I spoke to David also over Zoom, and he was in Bishkek. So where he is doing currently his research, I think he's now back in Berlin, but his current work explores how materialization and visions of Soviet urbanization inform the societal life of 2 cities in Central Asia and the Southern Caucasus. So he spends time in Yerevan as well as in Bishkek. And with these introductions, I now will turn over the floor to Ron, who's our first speaker, and then move on to David. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Melanie. That was a wonderful introduction to us. And thank you for all the organizers, Rolf, Roy, AGBU. This is a pleasure to be here this morning or this evening and to talk about the past that's led to a very difficult present for Armenians, particularly in the Caucasus. The recent war in Karabakh, I would argue, is the latest casualty of a troubled history of the Soviet Union, of its collapse, of the consequences of Lenin's nationality policy, and in a way, it is part of a continuing unraveling of the Soviet Union. So what we're faced with is what we can call a burden of history, maybe too much history, or an inconvenient history. The first point I would make about that history is that Armenians and Azerbaijanis, now two hostile nations who are fighting bloody conflicts in the Caucasus, in fact, like many other ethnic nations who now have a relatively exclusionary notion of what constitutes the nation, that we are like this and they are not, and create hostilities between them, are really part, in a funny way, of combined and shared histories and civilizations. In other words, Armenians and Azerbaijanis are both members of what might be called a broader Caucasian civilization. And they were both part of a great state, the Russian Empire, and later the Soviet Union, and were considered part of a Soviet people. So they share many things, and indeed, even a history in which sometimes you'll hear very nostalgic claims that we all got along together. But in recent times, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and problems over borders and indeed the contested area of Karabakh, both nations have tried to make exclusivist claims about their existence, their past, and their rights. Part of the reason for this is because in the current political geopolitics, the international community recognizes the right of states based on ethnicity, culture, and history. There are different kinds of claims made on territories. Some are, we got here first. This is our original homeland. Others are demographic. That is, we're the population now. We have a majority here. And still others are that we have painful histories based on exclusion, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide. So there are difficult and complex claims being made, all of them based in contested histories. Let's start not with the ancient past, because I would not argue that these are ancient tribal struggles, conflicts that go back into the deep past. But let's start with the Soviet period. Now, as a student of the Soviet Union, as someone who's written on the Soviet experiment, one of the things that I've tried in my career to illuminate is the way in which the Soviet Union, despite what many people in the West thought, that this was a system in which nationality was repressed, a totalitarian system in which claims to these kinds of cultures were in fact dismissed, the Soviet Union was actually in many ways the crucible or the seedbed of new nation states. This is most clear in Muslim states, traditionally Muslim states like those in Central Asia or Azerbaijan, but even states like Armenia and Georgia, cultures that can go back in time and have literary traditions, they were reshaped, reimagined in the Soviet period. And indeed, the republics of the Soviet Union, including Armenia and Azerbaijan, became over time more homogeneous ethnically. People who might be considered different from them were steadily left these countries, and over time, they became ethnically much more Armenian and Azerbaijani. The second thing about Soviet nationality policy was that in each republic, those peoples, the so-called titular nationalities, those whose name was in the name of the state, like Armenians in Armenia, Azerbaijanis in Azerbaijan, had a sense that they owned that republic. They're the ones who generally held power. They were granted favors from the state and from the center. And over time, indeed, particularly after the death of Stalin in 1953, the titular nationality, Armenians and Azerbaijanis in their own republic, aggrandized power and privilege within their ranks and actually limited the power and the extent and reach of the Central Soviet states, at least within their republic. Now, in the Soviet Union, national cultures were developed. Every state had their opera house and their conservatory and their film studio and so forth. No local cadres developed power in that republic. But national consciousness, even as it developed, could not be expressed in forms of what they called nationalism. And the great irony of Soviet nationality policy was that it was in fact directed to eliminate nationalism. It was supposed to eventually meld all the nationalities of the Soviet Union into a single Soviet people. It was supposed to reduce the political salience of nationality. But that's not what happened. In fact, over the 70 years of Soviet power, ethnicity was more deeply embedded into the politics, into the daily life, into the cultures of these peoples, giving advantages to some and disadvantages to others. But Karabakh was a special case. The Karabakh conflict, which in fact already smoldered under the Soviet Union, exploded once the imperial reach of Moscow became ever weaker. Karabakh was as a autonomous area within the state of Azerbaijan. Therefore, it was dominated by the capital, Baku, and the rights of Armenians, their power, their sovereignty, which was not real, in Karabakh was heavily limited. There were petitions, there were protests every once in a while, but once the hand of Moscow lifted under Gorbachev, beginning around 1985, Karabakhsis, the people of that region, as well as Armenians in Yerevan, began to demonstrate to bring this entity, Karabakh, into Armenia. It was some few miles from Armenia territorially. It had never had a contiguous boundary with Armenia. It was divided by something called the Lachin Corridor. But it was still about 75% ethnically Armenian. Armenians were a little bit fearful that they would lose dominance in Karabakh because their numbers had somewhat shrunk during the Soviet period from roughly 90% to 75%. But all through this time, the major claim to the territory for Armenians was ethnic and historical, and for Azerbaijanis was exactly the same, that we don't have ethnic dominance, but this is our land where our composers, our writers, our traditions, in fact, were originated. So you have this contested history that David will talk about, which is remembered in different ways. And then, particularly for Armenians, as the conflict developed in Karabakh in 1988, when Karabakh parliament, in fact, said they wanted to join with Armenia, violence broke out, first in the city of Sumgait, where Azerbaijanis murdered many Armenians, and an ethnic cleansing almost spontaneously occurred from that town and elsewhere, people fleeing for safety into Armenia. So for Armenians then, the whole thing, this conflict, the lost possibility of Karabakh was framed in the frame of genocide. So here's the first context, big context of this conflict. The contradictions of Lenin's nationality policy which created and deepened cultures and created in its wake some kinds of nationalism, and yet never true local autonomy in decision-making for the Karabakhis, no real political sovereignty. Karabakhis knew that they actually lived better than many Azerbaijanis, but they could see and they knew from relatives and others that they were not living as well as the Hayastansis across the border. And so there was a desire to unite with their brethren in Armenia. As I say, this conflict smoldered, developed, but did not explode until the imperial power, in fact, weakened. In some ways, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which has been seen often as a groundswell, a spontaneous bottom-up movement, in fact, was much more a case of the top of the center of Moscow, in a sense, committing suicide. That is, Gorbachev was relatively unwilling to use the kind of political and military force that he might have had and might have been able to use to keep the conflict within some restrictions. But in fact, things fell apart rather quickly. And once the Soviet Union dissolved, you had a conflict not between two republics in the Soviet Union, but you indeed had a conflict between two independent, hostile, sovereign states. For Armenians, of course, the way they frame this particular issue reverts back and remembers the suffering that Armenians endured 100 years earlier with the genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. But what we don't see so clearly among Armenians is the suffering that Azerbaijanis endured. Within Azerbaijan, there was a refugee and displaced person phenomenon, people who had left Armenia or been trucked out of Armenia and who desired return and revenge. Tens of thousands of Armenians and Azerbaijanis were killed in the wars that went on until the armistice that the Russians imposed in 1994. But those refugees now existed in railroad cars in Azerbaijan, near Baku, and they were a constant irritant, a constant force to remind the government that eventually they would have to return Karabakh to Azerbaijan. On both sides, atrocities occurred during that war up to 1994. Armenians will remember Sumgait and the Black January of Baku. Azerbaijanis will remember the tragedy at Kelbajar in March and April of 1993. And it's very interesting that Kelbajar is also mentioned repeatedly in the Republic of Turkey as a sign of Armenian violence and atrocity. What I'm saying then is there are no purely innocent sides in a war. And this idea, this frame of a genocide, or even a threat of a genocide, though real and something that people feel, in fact, is not something that is real. It's simply a way of imagining the past and the present. There was no genocide on either side, but there was violence, ethnic cleansing, and the threat that always existed. Conflict between these two people can also be seen as conflict between different principles, particularly the principle of national self-determination, a good Wilsonian or Leninist principle. That is, whoever exists on a territory should have the right to determine their existence and rule themselves. Good democratic principle, and that would favor the Armenians, who are the majority or were the majority in Karabakh. But then there is another principle, an international law principle of territorial integrity. That is, you can't just remove parts of a country from itself into another without the agreement of the first country. And territorial integrity as a principle, of course, favors Azerbaijan. So you had in 1994 an armistice, and for the next decades, there was a frozen conflict, but I would argue on both sides an unwillingness to compromise. Armenians had won the war in the 1990s. They benefited from the armistice of 1994, which was brokered by Boris Yeltsin's Russia. But they did not, in those decades, take advantage of the victorious position of their superiority in those decades to find a solution to the conflict. Of course, they were also faced by serious resistance by a defeated Azerbaijan. When the first president of Armenia, independent Armenia, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, tried to compromise, he was overthrown in a what's sometimes called legal coup d'etat. Years ago, political scientists now at Stanford, David Layton and I, wrote an article calling for compromise, but compromise was considered treason among many Armenians. And we wrote the following: as Armenians and Azerbaijanis must realize, victories do not necessarily yield peace. The present situation remains intolerable and unstable. It is intolerable because of the suffering on both sides. But those like Ter-Petrosyan who urged compromise found that neither side was ready to compromise. And so what happened in the intervening period? Azerbaijan, an oil-rich state, grew richer and stronger, closer to Turkey, aided by Turkey and eventually Israel. Their drones proved to be stronger and better than Russian drones, and they won the war in 2020. Think of the results of that war. A popular democracy in Armenia was defeated by a repressive dictatorial state in Azerbaijan. Democracy was set back by that defeat. That defeat, Armenia's defeat, was also a victory for Erdogan's Turkey, another repressive authoritarian state. Aliyev's Azerbaijan, Erdogan's Turkey, have now made authoritarianism and the ruthless repression of dissent, the elevation of right-wing nationalism, a positive effect of the defeat of the Armenians. The Turkish-Azerbaijani alliance is now stronger than ever, making Armenia more vulnerable. And, think about this, Russia weaker in the Southern Caucasus than it has ever been since 1828. Erdogan is already making agreements with Ukraine, a state hostile to Russia, selling them drones, and has not recognized Crimea as a legitimate annexation by Russia. So we're faced with a very peculiar and harsh geopolitical situation. Armenia's defeat was a defeat also for Armenia's only ally, Russia, and for Vladimir Putin himself. An ally of Russia was defeated in a war, and Russia could not or would not protect Armenia when it needed it most. For reasons of history and current politics, it is understandable why at the moment chaos and despair reign in Armenia. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, really, Ron. And I'm trying to pick up at where your talk came to an end, moving a bit away from the battlefield of history to the battlefield of memory politics. When we go back to February 1988 and crowds of people gathered on then Nagorno-Karabakh, which was then Lenin Square in the Armenian Soviet Republic, to demand this territorial reunification of Armenia and the Azerbaijani enclave Karabakh, so-called Miatsum, which was inhabited by Armenians for the most part. Slogans that at first glance do not fit well into this picture are seen and heard. The ethnologist Harutsun Marutian later notes that more than 1/3 of all posters shown at the protests of the Karabakh movement referred to the Armenian genocide of 1915. And I think one poster illustrates this very clearly, that links the genocide denied by Turkey to other experiences of violence in the collective memory of many Armenians. 1915, 1918, 1920, 1988, Ova Metavor, who is to blame, as the poster, of course, rhetorically. While 1915 here is a clear reference to the year of the Armenian genocide, 1918 and 1920 refer to the pogroms of Baku and Shusha, which were perpetrated by Azerbaijan's Armenians in the turmoil of the civil war. And 1988, and this is here decisive, refers to the present of that time. Here we see the unresolved traumatic experiences of the past becomes the prism through which the present is interpreted. Space of experience, Erfahrungsraum, and the horizon of expectation, that is the Erwartungshorizont, they merge together. When at the height of tensions here, the news reached the Armenian capital that Armenians had been killed in the industrial city of Sumgait by an agitated Azerbaijani mob, these pre-configured images of that very unreconciled past flash up again and give the present of that time a very clear-cut meaning. The Armenians are in the wake of a new genocide. But similar to Ron's argumentation, I argue that this attempt to describe the present with what Marx called die entborgte Sprache der Vergangenheit, that is the borrowed language of the past, proves to be often a fatal fallacy. Obviously, a decade-long experience of real coexistence gives here way to the view that we are not dealing here with a Soviet brother nation with which we engaged in a troublesome, but for most of the time, peaceful cohabitation. No, we deal here with the historical arch enemy itself. I think it was this existential fear that drove the majority of Soviet Armenian citizens into the then nationalistic hands of the then nationalist hardliners, those who believed that the Karabakh question knew only a military solution, and those who believed that Armenians down in Stepanaket or Khankendi would never be safe if the Azerbaijanis were enthroned above in the city of Shusha. 3 decades later, that is in the year 2020, last year, the war returned again. It's a new edition of an old war, only now with reverse plus-minus signs. And again, it is fought on the battlefield of the real and the battlefield of memory politics alike. In my own book here, Embattled Dreamlands, I propose a fourfold typology to make sense of this domain of contested memory politics. I argue here that we have 4 main domains: narrating, silencing, performing, and mapping. And at this point, here comes the first thesis of my talk, that is, the Karabakh War was framed by both sides, that is Armenia and Azerbaijan, along 2 distinctly different psychotemporal lines. That is, to put it more concretely, Armenians and Azerbaijanis were fighting each other on the battlefield, but Armenians were fighting with the ghosts of 100 years ago, while Azerbaijanians faced the ghosts of the 90s. What do I mean with this? When we look at the national speeches of the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, he would emphatically evoke the Battle of Satarapat, Satrapati Chakatamart, referring to the 1908 Battle of the Caucasus campaign of World War I, in which greatly outnumbered Armenian forces back then stopped the advance of Ottoman forces. I quote here, "This is a new Satrapat, Sami Nor Satrapate," Pashinyan said in a speech addressed to the nation on October 3. It continues, "They did not come just to conquer territories, villages, or cities. Their goal is the Armenians. Their goal is to continue their policy of the Armenian genocide. This framing here unmistakably put the war in a wider historical context. A second genocide is looming. This narrative was further underpinned by pan-Turkistic maps that circulated on Armenian social media that showed Armenia entrenched between a hostile Turkey to the west and a hostile conglomeration of Turkic peoples of Central Asia, Turkmens, Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, Uyghurs, Uzbeks, were here all loomed together as part of an alleged pan-Turkistic, pan-Turanistic agenda. Following this historical reading, many Armenians at the same time saw in the efforts of many international governments, media outlets, and also individuals to try to maintain an anti-war, more neutral position, not only an unethical form of both sidism, as it was often argued, but even worse, a repetition of the diplomatic indifference demonstrated by Western powers a century ago, which had made possible the Armenian genocide in the first place. But let's move now also to the other side. Because in contrast to this, in the Azerbaijani case, we're moving in a total different imaginary, in a total different realm of temporal imaginations. In contrast to this, on the Azerbaijani side, Karabakh served as a historical stage where the lost Karabakh War of the 90s, that is the post-Soviet period, could be reenacted at this theater of war, so that the disgraceful defeat of 3 decades ago could be redeemed. And here I quote from Aliyev, "Hocalı Kobanların intikamını dövüş meydanında aldık. We took revenge for the victims of Hocalı on the battlefield." He declared solemnly this year, 2021, on the annual commemoration day of the Hocalı massacre, when up to an estimate of around 600 ethnic Azerbaijani civilians were killed by Armenian armed forces in 1992. In this ensuing speech, Aliyev produces a narrative that, I quote, "From 1992 to the latest events, Armenian fascism dealt a great blow to the Azerbaijani people. And military provocations, terrorist acts, atrocities against the civilian population, the shelling of our cities and villages. At the same time, the bombing of peaceful cities with ballistic missiles during the Second Karabakh War, all these are manifestations of Armenian fascism," end of the quote. So we see here also the Hocalı is here emblematic of the entire military defeat of Azerbaijan and what was perceived not only as a military defeat, but of course also as a moment of disgrace on the side of Azerbaijan in the First Karabakh War. And I think that's something very important that also Lev Petrosyan stressed in one of his recent interviews, in which he was, of course, very pessimistic, where he argued that what we failed to ascertain from the Armenian side was the humiliation that is evoked by publication of maps that show Artsakh with the occupied territories around already as a de facto reality. So it is a painful reminder for Azerbaijan to the inability at that time to oppose the Armenian national movement and its claim to historical homeland, which again, in the 90s, we shouldn't forget, was not superior because of success in an academic debate, but by sheer military superiority. But here we move from narrating to silencing. As Karl Marx aptly put it, we, I quote, "anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them the names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honored disguise and borrowed language," end quote. Yet, as I already pointed out before, and Ron in his first talk, this way of narrating the present through the past is always selective, and it's always built on another important domain of memory politics, and it's that of silencing. Silencing here refers to the conscious suppression of historical and social political facts that run counter to one's own national narrative. In the Karabakh War, silencing applies to different elements, and it mainly applies to one thing, that is the fate of the ethnic other. The ethnic Armenian government of Artsakh is seeking for decades, was seeking for decades, for international recognition, presenting itself here as the legitimate representative of the people of Karabakh or Artsakh. Yet it has failed, I think, to this day, and it did also before the war, to address the question of what should really happen to the ethnic Azerbaijani population expelled not only from Karabakh proper, where they constituted a minority, but from the surrounding territories, so-called occupied territories, where Azerbaijanis partially consisted also majorities. Is the expulsion 3 decades ago just collateral damage? On the other hand, of course, the Azerbaijani government proudly proclaims the feat of delivering Karabakh out of the hands of Armenian separatists, to quote their language, or /terrorists, and restoring territorial integrity. That is the argumentation we see constantly repeated on the Azerbaijani side. However, of course, that leaves out a fundamental question, that is, what if the ethnic Armenian communities populating Karabakh or Artsakh today did not want to be liberated in the first place? And I think here comes the second argumentation, that is, the wrongs of the past cannot be righted by forcefully resettling one's own IDPs, this applies to Azerbaijan, at the expense of turning another population, that is the Armenians of Karabakh, into IDPs, into internally displaced persons. Yet, as we see, for the historical narratives to unfold their political power, they need to be inscribed into the landscape, into the geographical and material landscape. Here, mapping and renaming enters the game. It encompasses here all policies aimed at shifting the perceptions through the renaming of the geographical space. And here also the creation of new maps to describe this geography. And that becomes very interesting because already on November 13, and what is interesting, this is 3 days after the end of hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijani Parliament's Committee on Regional Affairs introduced a bill on, I quote, on renaming the village of Artsakh in the Khojavand region of Azerbaijan as the village of Huneli. The village, formerly inhabited by Armenians with its monastery complex of Artsakh, which is located in the Hadrut province in the southern part of Nagorno-Karabakh, is now, and we see this, to be fitted into the reconfigured symbolic landscape of an ethnically homogeneous Azerbaijani Karabakh by obtaining an Azerbaijani place name from Artsakh to Huneli. By not only renaming villages, but rivers, mountains. This, we see here how the renaming plays a crucial role in consolidating one's own and contesting at the same time the so-called enemy's national narrative. The virtual platform, and here another, simultaneously, also we see, of course, news on how Armenian inscriptions are removed and how churches and monasteries belonging to Armenians are now declared as belonging to not an Armenian civilization, but an obscure Caucasian Albanian civilization, which we can also discuss. And thus, and that's the important part, they are not part of the Armenian historical legacy. The virtual platform Virtual Karabakh in Azerbaijan informs here the reader, I quote, in ancient times, Karabakh was part of the ancient Azerbaijani state of Caucasian Albania. I open here a parenthesis. Caucasian Albania, of course, did exist as a historical entity. They were largely speaking a language that is partially similar to the present-day language of the Udi people, but the language is neither directly related to Armenian nor to Azerbaijani. I close my parenthesis. Consisting mainly of Turks and Caucasian tribes, Armenians who do not have deep roots in the Caucasus, Kafkas'ta köklü tarihleri olmayan, appropriated Caucasian Albanian monuments and changed their nationality in order to artificially create traces of their history there. And the Armenian inscription chiseled in stone at the doorsteps of the churches and monasteries, I quote here from the webpage of Ilham Aliyev, all fake. Yet, indeed, a medieval historian with whom I was in correspondence, and he was also among the guests, Dr. Heiko Konrad, confirmed that indeed the history of Caucasian Albania is very complex and far more than just the primordial history of Azerbaijan or Armenia. So here I come to my next and ultimate last thesis. Caucasian Albania has the potential here maybe to actually bridge across both, because it actually refers to a history of the Caucasus that lies beyond the parameters of both national histories, however, only if understood not as a tool of propaganda, but as the source of critical historical knowledge on the region's multi-layered, multi-ethnic, and multilingual realities. And I think I have around like 5 minutes, which I would like to use to just hint briefly at some initiatives that do exist that try to complicate the competing national narratives that currently dominate in the field of memory and history politics. I think one of them is for sure the platform Caucasus Talks, which was founded by Leon Aslanov and Diana Yailoyan in 2020, interestingly before the war and not related to the war. And what they try to do is to establish a candid and unmediated dialogue on interregional collaboration. Their idea was, and that was before the war, to specifically focus on topics that pertain to young Armenians and Azerbaijanis alike. That is the question of economic inequality, ecology, human rights violations, but also the influence of larger geopolitical actors, the preservation of cultural heritage, and gender rights. However, during the last years, the platform was itself pressured to react to the rising increase of hate speech and nationalism on both sides during the war, which prompted them to issue a peace statement. Interestingly, one of the very few peace statements that featured many signatories from both Armenia and Azerbaijan, which came at the expense of some of the Azerbaijani signatories facing actual persecution. So that I think is a very important thing. I know also from a currently ongoing project that they are working on a project where they try to bring together historians from Armenia and Azerbaijan and Georgia to work on a pan-Caucasian syllabus for university education. And this project is supposed to be carried through from this year onwards. And the idea is that this syllabus can then be actually used at universities that collaborate in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. Another thing I want to just very briefly mention is interesting initiative from Germany that is called Dolma Diaries, which is the project of an Armenian, Azerbaijani, Georgian humorous sitcom series. So you might think right now it's the worst time for this, but maybe it is the best time. The funders, Friedrich Ebert Foundation, obviously thought of the latter. It's the best time. And the idea is to have an approach where the audience will not be very actively asked to question their views on the neighbors, but instead, as this operates on the level of humor and on the level of day-to-day interaction, it appeals more to the unconscious. According to Oliver Müser, who is the producer of the series, he hopes that the entertaining series like Dolma Diaries might reach an audience here in the region beyond what we could call the peace activist bubble. And if everything goes according to the plan, the first 3 episodes will be shot in Berlin this summer. Ultimately, I have, I think, around 2 minutes left. That is enough for 4 sentences on the last initiative, which is maybe the most interesting ones. It's called Kavkazский Перекресток, so the Caucasus Crossroads. And unlike other peace initiatives, which often start from very intellectual circles and academic environments, Kavkazский Перекресток has a very low threshold approach. And due to the choice, not in English, but in Russian, it reaches, I would say, more diverse audiences beyond the urban centers. It is a Russian-speaking Facebook group with already around 1,000 members, mainly from Armenia and Azerbaijan. The main credo goes, I quote, "Don't forget, we are not politicians or historians. We will communicate as ordinary people. Мы будем общаться как обычные люди." The focus here lies in actually getting to know each other's life realities better. So they start not from the conflict, but from something quite reverse. So people here not only discuss everything from traditions of Muslim and Christian holidays, but something as mundane as the increase of prices of bus fares and metro fares in their capitals. And I think here the main goal is maybe achieved even best compared to all the other initiatives, that is to foster a sense of intersocietal normalization after the destructive experiences of the war. That brings me to my last sentence. Here I will ultimately end. To break out of this vicious circle, we need to first of all counter dehumanization and open room again for low-level encounters between обычные людей, which we all are, the ordinary people. Thanks a lot.
Thank you both so very much for your talks and to give us a little bit of an insight into both the contested history and the contested memory, but as well perhaps also a shared memory and a shared history. So I would encourage the audience to submit their questions into the chat, and we will address them as they come along. I would like to just briefly ask Ron and perhaps also David, one of the things that Ron, you mentioned in the very beginning of your talk. So this is, a lot of the conversation that you've now had is about contestation, and perhaps David, you are ending with this Facebook group that is about ordinary people and perhaps a shared experience. Ron, you mentioned in the very beginning of your talk a nostalgia towards a particular shared moment, and maybe You could elaborate a little bit more when the sort of rhetoric of nostalgia enters into the discourse, as David, of course, has now emphasized the discourse of division, the discourse of genocide as occurring in this more recent period.
As you know, Melanie, there was an upsurge some years ago, just as the last empire, the Soviet Union, collapsed. There was an upsurge among scholars in interest of empires. Because suddenly we were faced by these new phenomena, ethnic cleansing, the homogenization of new nation states all through Eastern Europe and through the former Soviet Union. And so people looked back to empires and thought, what was it that made them work? Now, there were clearly difficulties. Empires can be repressive, there are dominant groups and subordinate groups, etc. But there was an interest in how the sort of imperium might mediate these kinds of ethnic and other kinds of conflicts. And the Soviet Union was a good example of that. It tried. I always have argued that it was an empire, that is, with all of the hierarchies and inequalities of an empire. There were dominant groups, the Communist Party, Russians perhaps, and subordinate groups. And yet it tried to marry that imperial setup with the development of these national cultures and national republics without real political sovereignty, right? And so it's a kind of balance and a tension and a fragility that was maintained under Stalin, of course, with a very heavy hand, and after Stalin by allowing the republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, etc., greater autonomy, which had its own pathology because it led to corruption and local mafias, and Armenia and Azerbaijan have suffered from that. The whole Aliyev dynasty is based on this local patronage and control. But it managed these ethnic conflicts. And so people live normal lives, the обычные люди, that the common people that David talks about. If there was conflict, it was at a soccer game, at a football game, about this or that. But it's extraordinary that Leninist policy worked as well as it did until the Gorbachev period. And then when real liberalization and democratization began to take place, those conflicts which were there, which had not, and tensions that had not been solved in those years of imperial rule, began to come out. Not because they're absolutely natural, that they were inevitable, but rather given the particular conjuncture in which they occurred, the historical moment, they took a certain form. And David so eloquently showed that. That is because what were the historical frames available? Yeah. Nationalism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, all of those things. So nostalgia certainly was there, shared experiences were there. But when I tried to give a talk about that in around 1998, I was called Davajan, because you were trying to say something which was foreign to the political leaders and what they required at the moment.
Thank you. David, do you see this sort of in your work, do you see that as you're looking at memory, that nostalgia is part of the discourse or not at all?
Muted, David. David, you're muted.
Well, my main research was engaging with the question of politics of memory in the context of Turks, Armenians, and Kurds. And here I was mainly engaging also with questions of, lost territories in the Van region. And there, of course, I encountered many incidents of what we could call nostalgia. I think the whole reimagination of Armenian Hayastan, of Western Armenia. And I mean, it's kind of interesting, but and somehow it's also understandable, given this incredibly destructive, painful experience of losing one's home in Armenian genocide. I'm sometimes really wondered how few, and I think I'm again quote here actually someone like Lev Petrosyan, how few empathy actually was shown to the expulsion of Azerbaijanis as a kind of collateral damage of the First Karabakh War, right? And we're talking here really also about the areas surrounding Karabakh. And I think what the problem that was made, in my opinion, was that on the one hand, I had the feeling, and of course I look inevitably from the inner Armenian perspective, because that's a perspective I know, but I had the feeling that one's own affective ties, emotionality was always perceived as genuine. But the emotionality of the other, that is in that sense Azerbaijan, was always understood as propaganda. And of course, it's not very surprising that on the other hand, we have the reverse scenario. But I think that this is maybe, and that's also why I ended on the note of actually rehumanization, which also then comes along with empathy, is to really take emotionality at face value. We have an exploitation of these affective realms, of course, on both sides and beyond. But that doesn't belie the fact that there is an emotional kernel of the truth of this emotionality on both sides. And I think that this was one of the problems, I think, in the post-First Karabakh period, that these emotions were not understood in their also destructive potential that they could unfold in the face in terms of revenge and anger that we saw now in the war last year.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess this brings us to a question that just came in concerning, or sort of carrying on in the same vein here, which is about the shared Soviet history. So the question is, what happened with the Armenians in the region of Nakhchivan concerning the possibilities of reconciliation on the basis of the Albanian history? So this goes back to also what, David, you've been talking about. How can we understand the destruction of Christian heritage in Nakhchivan and also in the recently lost territories of Nagorno-Karabakh, which then perhaps also moves towards the question of mapping at some point?
Yeah, so we start from kind of the last question, right?
Yeah. Because I think it goes well with what we've.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most kind of placative way to express it would be, I would argue that bringing Caucasus Albania by the Azerbaijani government, obviously, of course, for reasons of claim making, can end up with Azerbaijan or the Azerbaijani government shooting its own leg, I would argue. Because the interesting thing is that indeed, Caucasus Albania opens up another history that lies beyond that of primordial Armenian or Azerbaijani history. On the other hand, of course, we see also that the history itself will make it more complicated. Why do I think so? And that will partially refer back to Karabakh and not to Nakhchivan, but I think I will indirectly answer the question. The interesting thing is that, as we know from the Armenian side, we had Udi people, that is, we had Udi speakers that are the so-called descendants of the age of historical Caucasus Albania, at least lingually. That is as true as it is true for the link between Aramaic speakers and present-day Assyrians and the ancient Assyrians of the past. So very vague, but there is a link. But the interesting thing is we saw that we had Udi people which were Islamized, and we had Udi people who were Christians. And according to that level, we saw that Udi people who were Christians, on which Azerbaijan now tries to build the historical claims, were actually expelled together with Armenians during the Karabakh War from villages like Vartashen. So the question is then, which was now renamed to Oslo, if I remember right. So you see, I'm indirectly giving an answer to this question. The interesting thing is that this history of Caucasus Albania, I think we shouldn't be afraid, and this is something that I came to a conclusion in discussion with the historian Dr. Konrad. I think we shouldn't be actually afraid of this, even though that is part of Azerbaijani claim making, but we should rather embrace this discourse and say, okay, let's see what we really find when we engage with the history of Caucasus Albania and the link to Udi people, because we see that things are far more complicated than can be fitted in the framework of a nationalist propaganda as we see it right now on the Azerbaijani side.
On Nakhchivan, it's really interesting. So Nakhchivan, if you go back far enough, had a large Armenian population and various kinds of Armenian polities there, etc. But over time, it became increasingly Islamized. And by the time the Soviet Union was formed, Armenians made up a very small portion of the population of Nakhchivan. They were majority in Karabakh, but very small in Nakhchivan. Armenians, however, were fearful that the fate of Armenians in Karabakh would repeat the fate of Armenians in Nakhchivan, that is, that they would become Islamized or expelled or whatever. I have a student, former student, now a professor, who did some research on incidents about Nakhchivan in the 1940s. When I first looked at that evidence, I saw that Armenians seemed to be moving out of Nakhichevan, or were moved by the Soviet government, and Azerbaijanis were being moved out of Armenia into Nakhichevan by the Stalinist government. And I thought, oh, there must be a policy here to homogenize these republics. And this is directed from Moscow. This is a policy. Well, my student did what good historians do. She went to the archives. This is Krista Goff. And she went to the archives and she found out that actually there were agreements between the communist leadership of Armenia and of Azerbaijan to move those people. They were going to develop cotton growing in Nakhichevan, and they were going to bring people there for this purpose, etc. So it's a much more complicated picture than the way it is then read in ignorance and without evidence, forced Soviet homogenization of those republics. But again, getting back to the memory politics that David expressed so beautifully, the way it's read is that that was a fate we must avoid for Armenians. That is, what happened in Nakhichevan must not happen in Karabakh. So much of what is driving this thing are precisely certain dominant emotions. And one of them, of course, is fear of what has happened and anxiety. What is anxiety? Anxiety is emotion of fear without an object. It's fear of a possible future. And that future is read through the past: genocide, ethnic cleansing, assimilation, etc. And those are hard things to overcome. And so we're now in a period of unbelievably deep hostility, fear, and anxiety on the Armenian side particularly. Azerbaijan is now triumphing because of its defeat of the Armenians last year, but that's also a dangerous position, right? A very dangerous position. The one that Armenians experienced in 1994 is now being repeated by Azerbaijanis in 2020 and 2021. This is an unstable, intolerable situation, and it will not last.
Thank you, Ron.
Maybe adding to this, and I will also then pick up on one of the questions that was pertaining to toponymy in the general sense, if I may. I think something that maybe has not been addressed adequately also in my talk was the way how the Armenian genocide of 1915 is truly historically intertwined with the current conflict. And because I think there's something that is beyond the level of memory politics. I mean, there's many things that is beyond memory politics, but something I have in particular in mind. I was currently doing research on urban transformations in Yerevan, and there I come across the statistics that the population of Yerevan between the years of 1910 to 1916 increased by 1/3. That is, we have 1/3 of the whole population we can assume that are genocide survivors that came from the Ottoman provinces after the genocide. And this applies to other provinces too. And in this slide, why am I mentioning this? In this slide, we have to read the current Azerbaijani state narrative on that basically declares large parts of Armenia to be something like in Western Azerbaijan. Well, the truth is there was a far stronger Muslim presence in Armenia before the Armenian genocide, but the selective plotting is to talk about Azerbaijanis expelled from Armenia without talking about the Armenian genocide. And that of course applies both to to Azerbaijan, but mainly to Turkey. So I think here I would argue that it is not only the constructed continuity, but there is an actual link of the genocide as an event of massive uprooting, as an event that fundamentally changed the demographics of the region. And this now links back to the question of toponymy. And here it is very interesting, that is also was part of my own research. I relied here on the fabulous study by Arsen Saparov. But what he showed is that in many areas like Artashet, Artsakh, Spitak, Masis, Yerevan, the number of villages that were changed from Persian or Azerbaijani to Armenian during the Soviet period was around 80 to 90%. So before we now start talking about Azerbaijanis changing village names from Armenian to Azerbaijani Karabakh, we should also remember that most of the villages around Yerevan, around Surmalu, that is Armavir, had been Persian or Azerbaijani named before the Soviet period. So I think that's also kind of important. Of course, that is linked to the fact that we have the influx of populations as a result of the Armenian genocide. But I think that shows also how there can be not a reconciliation of one issue without reconciliation of another event of historical violence, in that case, the Armenian genocide. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, David. And I think that was a really nice way to come back to the mapping and naming question. Maybe Ron, would you want to comment on it in terms of sort of the history of naming and mapping in the context of nationalism and these formations of homogenized nation states as a sort of phenomena, a historical phenomenon?
This seems to be a general policy that when you get your state, then you change the names, from, Hermanngard to Sibiu or whatever. That's in Romania, but it goes all over the place. There's another thing that's going on, and if you think about, and one of the questioners asked this question, there's another way in which people are imagining the future maps of their country, and we have a state in the Middle East, Israel, which has no real frontiers and which expands constantly at the expense of Palestinians. Now, that's a dominant vision and possibility for small nations to think about. And there was a way in which Armenians from 1994 to 2020 thought of themselves in a way as a little Israel, that they could actually ethnically cleanse certain areas outside of Karabakh and try to settle people there. Not many went, but they tried such things, and we're just not that strong a state. And I imagine, and I can see ways in which Azerbaijan might be probing in a similar direction. If you look at the maps that Azerbaijan produces, they produce maps of what they call Western Azerbaijan, which is the current state of Armenia, of the Republic of Armenia. In other words, these kinds of examples that you can shift boundaries by probing or victories in wars without agreement mutually between states, even though Azerbaijan is making strong arguments about territorial integrity, at the same time, they seem to be moving into places like Suny, Zangezur, and so forth, which of course is a great threat to the mediator in that area, which is Russia, which is in a very fragile and difficult position, and is also, I think, very wary of an expansion of this conflict with Turkey. Mute.
Sorry, I was muted. So inherently, you've answered or began to answer the question of Mr. Hagopian around self-determination versus territorial integrity. David, would you want to comment on this at all, or no? Moving on. So then I would like to move to the question that is by Carol Mann, that is for David. And she says the lack of empathy on the Armenian side for Azerbaijani IDP seems to be a kind of blindness or narrowing of the visions. You also see by Israelis facing Palestinians, tragedy does not make you empathetic, as we know from Israel's refusal to recognition of the Armenian genocide. Would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Of course, I would, however, also add that we have this lack of empathy operating on different levels, right? We have it also on the level of Israel supplying arms to a country that is currently in conflict, right? Which makes a bit of difference from the weapons that both sides receive from Russia, because they are kind of the Israel operates here as the proxy for state-of-the-art Western produced weapons, which you can normally not easily buy, even with a lot of oil money. But I think the real problem is, I think, in addition to blindness, which absolutely applies, I think it is also basically fear. I think that's also what Ron mentioned. I think the fear of concessions. I think also the fear that once you actually recognize the pain of the other, you end up also recognizing the maximalistic claims of the other. And I think that is something where also I think both sides should critically question, am I can I be subject to empathy with the claims, with the stance that I take? And I think that was also a large problem. I think that, I mean, of course, I see more the kind of mystics, as I said, because I have this more, let's say, inner Armenian perspective. I see more the mystics from within the Armenian perspective. But of course, also when you have Azerbaijan running like an absolutely hostile educational policy, media policy for 3 decades, you open very few space, I think also for Armenians to basically engage, to share this pain without fearing that you end up actually legitimizing maximalistic claims that will ultimately end in the absolute erasure of Armenian populations in a given territory of Karabakh. So I think that was also the problem. The other problem, and that is something I think Ron mentioned, is what this kind of, I would call it like the diaspora dilemma, that is only the Azgaina mold. So only the good Armenian patriot is accepted as someone who can speak on behalf of Armenians. If you are ethnic Armenian but you're living outside Armenia and you engage critically with it, then you're just Davajan and you should actually just shut up. I think that's another big problem. So we have, in some sense, a lot of variety of different voices from the outset, but we have only certain voices that are allowed to speak on behalf of Armenia. And I think that is, a general problem, and how to address this, I think, is important. Also, how to get, I think, more Armenians that do not identify maybe with the, let's say, ultra-right national cause into the diaspora as a sense of a realm in which Armenians can come together. But as I said, I mean, I think most of you can assert and appreciate this question far better than I do as a Wachai.
Yeah, you know, David, that's a good point. I would say things were changing before the war. We'll see how this shakes out. That is, the Davajan and the closing of alternative voices was very strong in the first decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then people, you know, Armenia was opening to the West, to other trends, to new social science, new views about nation, nationalism, constructivism, etc. I found a much softening toward my own work, more acceptance by young people particularly. It's true that old elites, old communist elites, became fiercely nationalistic. It's interesting how quickly they changed their clothing. But in general, younger people were much more accepting of some of these things, and that gives the hopeful sign to what David was talking about in terms of these peace initiatives. But I want to say one other thing. It's not the same in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Yeah. Armenia is a relatively open society with an unbelievably fearless civil society. All during the years of the various rules of what I would call almost mafia bosses who ran Armenia after Tepetosyan, all those years, civil society was alive and well, fearless, even when their own government shot down people in the streets after an election, right? That does not exist in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a closed society. You cannot express yourself except in this fervor, pro-Azerbaijani, anti-Armenian fervor. What's so interesting is the formation of nationalisms in each of these countries. Yeah. Azerbaijani nationalism was a reactive nationalism. It did not really exist. I was writing about this 20 years ago. It did not exist in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijanis had very fluid and contested identities. Are we Shia Muslims? Are we like Anatolian Turks? Are we Soviets? What are we exactly? And their nationalism formed, regrettably, as fundamentally hostile to Armenians, to these people who think they're better than us. A lot of us Armenians do think we're better than everyone else. That's a problem we have, but we'll go around that at the moment. But there was a sense in which Azerbaijanis are victims of this cosmopolitan, dominant, educated elite that looks down upon us. And much of our Azerbaijani nationalism, which is now in its most heightened form, is based on a hostile anti-Armenian fundamentalism. And that's very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ron, for also sort of bringing us to sort of pointing out the difference between society within Armenia and Azerbaijan, and also the diaspora. And this comes back to David's point of grassroots organization and peace initiatives. And I've just recently was part of a conversation by a young scholar here in Berlin, who was talking about the Turkish and Armenian diaspora and the peace initiatives and talks that are going on here in Berlin through artistic grassroots organizations. And it seems like, David, some of the things that you're talking about are quite similar. So I thank you both for this wonderful conversation. I've received note that we should wrap it up, and I would just remind those of you who we didn't get to your questions that there will be another opportunity in September to perhaps talk about, in particular, the role of Iran in this in the Caucasus as a political actor. Might be a question that will be better answered there. I'm going to just thank everyone for being here, and thank you, Ron and David, for this really great conversation and sharing your work and your knowledge of history and contemporary memory, politics. And I will turn it over to Roy to wrap up the session. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. As we can see, there's a lot to discuss about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and I think we made first steps with this event to get a grasp of what happened and is still happening in a region troubled by violence for decades. So I would like to thank the panelists, Ron, David, and Melanie, and of course the audience for the questions. And together with the AGBU Lebanon, we will continue this series in September with an event which will discuss more geopolitical aspects of the conflict. So you are all welcome to join, and we'll keep you, of course, updated on the details. So enjoy your evenings or mornings and stay safe, and goodbye.